My dad said, you know, people who aren't like you aren't your people. And I guess that does resonate in some way. It sits in my unconscious.
What bothers me is that we keep having the same conversations cropping up in the media, in the newspaper, in debate, in our offices.
I hoped that these sessions would help me to understand my position, my privilege, but also how this all plays out for everyone else.
Abby and I talked about possible projects we could do, and we both really had an interest in having conversations around multiculturalism and racism, and that's also sort of my area of research at the moment. So we were interested in having those conversations with adults who had grown up in some way in what we were talking about as diverse spaces, or growing up multicultural was the strand of the UCL Grand Challenges funding.
We had three main aims for the project. Really, the first was to just develop group conversations around these topics of multiculturalism and racism. The second was to then reflect on the conversations and on the process of having those conversations. And the final one was to document all of that in a film to hopefully inspire other people to try and do the same thing and to continue the conversations.
In session one, we wanted people to start thinking about how we spoke to each other and how we interacted. But a lot of the literature on racism talks about how dialogue is set up in such a way that it advantages some and disadvantages others through sort of rules about behaviour and modes of interaction. I gave the participants a series of statements that I had heard in my work or encountered in my reading. Before we talk about multiculturalism and racism, we need to establish ground rules. Talking about racism can make people feel uncomfortable. Our attitude to racism is shaped in our childhood. We should always aim to find areas of commonality in our discussions. It's important that we stay calm when discussing racism. Black people cannot be objective about racism. White people cannot understand what it feels like to experience racism. If someone becomes upset, we should stop the discussion. Discussion spaces reserved for people of a particular racialized identity are a bad idea. Multiculturalism has affected my life in a significant way. Racism has affected my life in a significant way. And on each statement, after people had had a chance to position themselves on the spectrum to show how strongly they agreed or disagreed, they were given the chance to explain their position. And we got to see that people position themselves in a wide range on the spectrum in respect to nearly every statement. This exercise was useful because it allowed us to notice that there were different opinions. It didn't force us to all converge on one position, and it also set the tone for the idea that the way we interacted was itself part of the conversation and was up for negotiation rather than something that was going to be imposed on the group by me. After the first session, Abby and I spoke about how at certain points the conversation was quite emotional, and that wasn't a bad thing, but that we wanted to make sure that there was always a space at the start of each session that followed for people to reflect on the previous session and to share anything that they'd sort of been dwelling on in between sessions. After yesterday's session, did anything sort of come to mind afterwards?
When people talk about an experience of childhood trauma, which happened yesterday as a racist incident as a child, I feel like it's really important when I hear something like that to just give it that space to fully recognise how awful it is and say, I'm really sorry that happened. If you don't say that, then it reinforces this idea that it's normal. I mean, maybe let's just pause, like if someone says something, if there's a gravity to what they've said, you know, we don't need to rush on. But I don't know if that's too interfering, like.
I think it's difficult because I think conversation has different rhythms and sometimes things get sped up, get a bit louder. And essentially goes back to some of our discussion about ground rules, that if everything's too procedural, we end up, I think, adhering to procedure rather than to what you're asking us is actually the sort of effective moment. Does anyone want to share anything?
Sort of at the end, I think Zara, you raised that why isn't there any white male here? I felt guilty for, in a way, vilifying the fact that there wasn't a white male here, because if they don't know that they should be part of a conversation, maybe that's why they're not here.
I totally understand your point of view, but for me, I think that having the notion that they're not here because they don't know that they need to be here is slightly naive. I think they do know, but it's a case of denial. They don't need to be here because for them it's not a problem.
That's how I felt here. But then I thought I should probably be a bit more balanced. And
I guess we're in a tricky territory because we're kind of speculating about people who aren't present as to their reasons for not being present. Any further reflections on yesterday?
One of the statements, the last statement from yesterday's session, I had a lot to think about when I went home with that one, and the idea of being objective,
right,
and the whole idea of objectivity and what that means. And sometimes I think if you have an emotional response to something, it can be seen as something negative. If you're impassioned or if you're enthused about something, it's almost as though you need to put that in a box or compartmentalise that or control that and curb that, because otherwise you become that angry black Asian Muslim woman ranting, raving, because any emotional response or any feeling or any emotion is my truth, is your truth, is their truth. So I don't think objectivity is something to be put on a pedestal. I sometimes feel it's something that's used as a stick to beat down people of colour.
Where the space is for building shared understandings, so that I don't respond to just by going, well, that's your truth, it's not mine, mine's something else.
Again, I think almost the discussion about truth comes back to this thing about objectivity. What do we even mean by truth? So sometimes I think it's about sitting in somebody else's experience, seeing it how they see it. And you don't necessarily have to agree with that, you just have to see their world.
For the second session, we wanted to start with a shared experience. So I wrote an email which was based on a couple of emails I'd received only a few weeks earlier. We read the email and then I asked people to come up with questions about things that were puzzling or interesting to them. This is an approach that I've learned from using P4C, or Philosophy for Children. Just to give you context, this is basically not quite verbatim, but this is based on an email I received. Dear Darren, I read and greatly enjoyed, this is not just me just trying to big myself up, by the way, although I'm sure it could be interpreted that. I read and greatly enjoyed your essay in The Good Immigrant. I'm running a series of lunchtime seminars at, I didn't want to name the university, Prestige University, on the theme of immigration, multicultural and racism. I think the students would learn a great deal from you. Would you be willing to come and give a talk on your work this term? Unfortunately, we don't have a budget to pay a speaker's fee, but we can pay for your travel. We can also offer you a free lunch with our highly motivated student. That was actually, I look forward to hearing from you. Kind regards, an organiser. So, I'd like to use this as a chance for us to talk about any issues we see in that, and I'm not at the moment assuming that we're all, seeing this from in the same way. So let's just hear the questions that people have got.
Does it highlight a bigger issue in the curriculum that maybe they're not addressing, and so having yourself come in is just a sort of a quick fix, just a band-aid over bigger issues?
It's almost as if the one-time opportunity that can be offered will tick a box. Is it just a tick box exercise?
So is the payoff for intellectual labour around racism that people thank you, that they're grateful, rather than monetary?
We've heard all the questions. Does anyone want to propose that we focus on one?
I'm interested in the box ticking idea because there is so much being thrown around that universities value diversity and have all these strategies in place.
So what would a meaningful engagement with the topic be, do you think?
I think if you're a prestige university, then where's the investment being made into all of these? It's it's nice to hear a thank you, but actually show me the money, because ultimately, unless there's a real investment made that's tangible and concrete, then this just becomes, oh, Darren came in, it was really nice, let's move on.
So part of it being meaningful might be financial investment.
I find it funny that, like, because I think many organisations, just not at university, have those like unconscious bias or those kind of like diversity training and stuff, and those are run by like, you know, like consultants or people who work at this kind of diversity industries, you know. So those people are paid.
I just thought, well, why is it a proper table seminar to go with a lecture or something proper? I just thought lunchtime, if you've got a time, if you're not doing anything else, come and pop in, have a listen to Darren while you're eating your sandwich or whatever, and then pop out. I just thought that was, for me, was the biggest slap in the face, and that is the biggest tick box.
Well, let me put forward a possible response to that. Then this is an opportunity to speak to an audience and perhaps do some good anti-racist work, but in tension with these other things we're raising.
Some of the requests I've had to do things for free have come because black women before me have done them for free, and that expectation has been set up. And actually, I don't want to set that expectation for other people, because I do think it ends up being a form of disrespect.
It grinds, you know, people down to them being just that beacon of knowledge about race. Whenever race gets mentioned in the classroom and the teacher who doesn't know how to deal with it panics, they come to me. So the assumed position was, he's black, he knows how to deal with this situation.
I think there's also another issue, this idea that the money is symbolic. It's actually how you value these ideas. And everybody's time is precious. Your time is precious, your time is precious. And if you're asking people to give that up, what's the greater good? If there was one person writing independently as they were running a project on their own, and they had no backing and no support, I think it'd be different and you would react differently. However, they're speaking on behalf of an institution, and they're choosing not to make that investment.
Even if they paid you for that time, would you felt it was purposeful? That's what was, it's back to what you were saying. It's a lunchtime to cover all of those things. That is not enough time to shake or to make people reflect and think.
But again, I guess there's this possible perception then that the institution might have of, well, we're trying to reach out. People watching this might say, well, you know, they're saying that there aren't any white men here, but then they're also saying that white men should be listening more, and then they're also saying that they don't want to educate white men.
The first lesson that can be given is almost a dissection of the email to the person who wrote it. So then that's the first step on that road to educating someone who's not seen that they've done anything wrong.
One of the topics that came up from discussing the email was the question of where the responsibility for educating about racism lies.
I think, OJ, the thing I feel is that you have a lot to teach me. And I guess my worry is that you have a lot to teach, but you've obviously been quite burned by people being really dumb. And I'm just wondering, and I don't know if it's a question or not, but it's sort of this, if this is about facilitating conversations about multiculturalism, and this is about making, you know, people understand more and appreciate things more, how am I going to make sure that I hear what you're saying? How are we going to make sure that I can hear what you're saying if I'm going to mess up, because I inevitably will, I feel?
Let me ask you a question in return. What investment, how can you demonstrate to me that you've invested in the survival of my daughter, of a young man just killed in Stratford by the police? When you can demonstrate to me that you have a serious investment in my survival, and that you see my survival and my thriving as essential to your own survival and thriving, you see those two things as compatible, then we can have a conversation. So
what would that look like then? What would my investment look like?
I throw that question back to you. What would that look like?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. Obviously, I could totally relate with it. But for me, that's jumping jumping miles. There's little steps that we need to take. And that's why I think, as much as they came at you wrong here, there's something in here, like you were saying. They are making a tiny step, pigeon step, to reach out. And I do think that there's valuable lessons that could be learned here, not in the lunchtime. So me, I would go back to like you were saying and rephrase this email, not in a negative way, not slap them back, not say anything, say, do you know what, I would love to come. And like, I'm so glad that you're interested in my work, that I'd love to come. But how about next academic year when you've got a fresh budget and no, the money's there next year, so I'll come next year. And how about we do a week, we do a week-long, intensive course on
After each of the sessions, we spent a bit of time with the participants because we wanted to hear their thoughts and feelings about the group conversation.
What sort of issues sort of jumped out for you that we were discussing today?
So a couple of issues that jumped out to me was that we made a lot of assumptions.
And did you feel able to sort of raise that point and
I didn't raise that point. I didn't want to offend anyone because people were getting, not emotional, but excited about what they were saying, I guess.
So you didn't really feel able to?
I didn't feel able to, yeah.
I feel a bit sad that you didn't feel confident enough to do it, because I think that would have been a really good point to put across, because it's all about us learning from each other.
I just don't want to, I feel so bad about offending people, which, yeah, I don't want to, people were, actually that was a genuine fear. So I don't want to create it, I don't want to allow it to not be a safe space for other people.
I think offering a different viewpoint, no one's going to, begrudge you for that.
Has it been easy to sort of feel like you're part of the conversation, or has that felt challenging?
No, I mean, obviously there's been kind of challenging topics or questions, but I think it's like you said, it's a very good forum to explore them, and obviously I don't think all of us necessarily always agree on everything, but that's the nature of how things are.
It has been a place where it's been managed well enough so that even when there is difference, it's not too explosive or conflicting, but it could have been.
The thing that appealed to me was the idea that I am living and hope to live for a long time in a multicultural society. It doesn't seem to be working at the moment from my point of view. It doesn't seem to really work for everyone. I don't feel like everyone has agency, and that it bothers me and it upsets me. So I wanted to come and I wanted to learn, and I did feel slightly nervous about coming because we've talked about this in the sessions, but was this for me? But I felt it was for me because I am living here and I'm living in a multicultural society. I'm living in a privileged position from my perspective, and I get that not everyone gets what I get, but I don't really understand it as well as I should or I want to.
There's times when I feel like individual experience can't be used as a template. But I think being part of these discussions has reinforced that it's not just individualism, it's not just individual experience. And I think that's, if you like, one of the ways that racism works is that it makes you think it's all you. And that your experience is unique rather than common.
So I suppose the thing I'm thinking is, what can I do with what I learn? I hope I can have more informed conversations with people I know. I hope I can challenge people more meaningfully when they say things, because people say things all the time that are racist. And sometimes it feels difficult to find the right way of challenging it in a way that will stay with them.
Abby and I felt that session 2 had gone well, but we were both aware that the starting point had come from my experience. In the third session, I asked participants to share similar experiences for us to think about together. However, this turned into a discussion about the ethics of asking people to share experiences. One concern was the potential for people to question how you've interpreted your own experience, and also the emotional impact of this when the experience is one of racism. For our final session, we chose to focus on a current topic, namely cultural appropriation. We began by reading 3 pieces on the subject. which raised a number of different, often contrasting arguments.
Sort of my views are sort of far more in line with sort of Adam and Amandla, and like so far away from Kenan that it's just not even on the page.
Okay, so we've got a positioning. Can you say a little bit more about him missing the point?
I think there's a very fine line between embracing other cultures and taking something and not understanding the roots and what it means to the people of that culture.
One of the things he argued is that, cultural appropriation should be seen as an exchange. But surely when you think of when I think of Erasmus, European Union, exchange students, it's a quid pro quo. I come to you, you come to me. It's a level thing here. Yeah, we're both gaining. Cultural appropriation is not like that. So I'm not sure what he was, really trying to say.
Particularly if you look at, for example, black music and the way that that's portrayed today, one of the things that has been done so well that it's barely noticed is you take it from its culture, you corrupt it, you monetize it, and then you sell it back not just to white people but to black people as well. So it's corrupted, and in that act of corruption you end up doing violence to the people that you've stolen it from.
Where the violence is really extreme for me is where it's repackaged to children and sold to children or teenagers, or that absolutely lack agency in a lot of ways.
I don't know if I would say violence. I would say I can see the reason to call it that, but I would also say there's a huge amount of ignorance. Without knowing that context and the history, I think it's almost as though you don't know what you're representing or symbolising, and that can be so dangerous and at times I think offensive. And when you're talking about children, and if they're not studying, and their curriculum is not adequately preparing them, that they don't know the origins of this music, this idea, this culture, and it's sold as a mainstream, everyone can do yoga, that's great, everyone can listen to rap music, that's great.
My daughter, for example, she's 14 and she's constantly saying, you can't do that, that's cultural appropriation. She's telling off her little sister. And so, part of educating is to say, okay, tell us a little bit more about that. What do you know about that, and why is that cultural appropriation? And then we start to tie ourselves in knots and Google things and read and... Do you see what I mean? So controlling language or controlling action without giving the time, the only way you can combat ignorance is to go and search for truth.
Some of the things I've worked on about Chinese culture, for example, and then so who can be Chinese, who can't be considered as an authentic Chinese person, or you don't speak Chinese, so you don't. So you have an idealized kind of construction of what constitutes what is culture, and then there's some kind of package that it has to be passed down.
So fixing what the culture is, and then expecting certain people to be in the culture or out of the culture.
Right, and saying who's authentic and who you're not authentic and you are, and that kind of thing.
As black people, we're really open, and we give a lot. And then other cultures are a lot more closed, and they keep to preserve their culture, and it's absolutely necessary in my opinion, but to preserve their culture, their history and their tradition, they're a lot more closed. If ethnic minority groups allow people to just come free for, take what you want, change it, make it into whatever you want to make it, 50, 100 years down the line, well, we have just a mesh of mix match of everything. I just can't see. I think you have to draw the line somewhere.
So, can you say a bit more about what do you mean by draw the line?
Okay, that sounds really bad now, the draw the line thing. It makes you think, no, you're not allowed. I don't want to say draw the line, but I think that to preserve, to protect, really, to protect where you're coming from.
Not all aspects of culture should be preserved. That's number one, because there are some abysmal aspects of culture that should be erased. Yeah? Not forgotten. I'm going to give an example that is quite topical in schools at the moment. We've all been made to go on training for on FGM, for example. So that I would say is not a religious practice, it's a cultural practice.
There were a wide range of ideas put forward in our discussion. we touched on a number of big questions that probably deserve more time and attention. Who, if anyone, owns a culture? Who is a cultural insider, outsider, and who decides? To what extent is culture a tradition or a process? What should be preserved? How important is economic power to understanding culture? How does cultural appropriation relate to racism? Can cultures change without appropriation? How important is history when thinking about cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I was just going to say something about the idea that, you know, we need to draw the line. I know you didn't like that phrase, but the idea that you do need to protect the culture in its original form and not dilute it in any way. I think with the level of movement we have now, more so than ever probably if we look back in history, I think it becomes harder and harder to preserve cultures as over generations. I don't mean within a generation, I think that's to do with choice. But if I just give you a really brief example, my parents are both from India. They came over here in the 60s and 70s and they dressed in a completely different way from me. I've decided as the next generation to make some changes to the way that I use clothes. I've tried to adjust into the society in a way that my mum and dad never really did, because maybe they didn't know how and they didn't feel empowered to do so. You know, I don't think my children will dress the way I dress. I think there will be a changing over time, and there will be a kind of element of fluidity in some things. I think there are some things that we'd want to preserve, like my faith and my practice of my faith, definitely. But I think this idea of holding on to things in their entirety and in their purest almost state is hard.
So I would use the example of food. So for me, it's really important, just like my grandma taught my mum teaches me, I'm definitely going to teach my children to know how to cook Jamaican food, for example, or to talk a certain way into that's because that's our culture, and to know where you came from. So this is another thing. I have a conversation with some of my friends I know who are American. Now it's difficult for them because they've been in America, and black people have been in America for hundreds of years. So they're American. So that's what they see. But because black people have not been here that long, we still are able to hold on to certain elements of our culture. So I know eventually it probably will be like that. But then that's why I think it's really important to try and hold on to certain aspects, because otherwise, to remember where you came from, I just think it's important.
Putting this notion out there, would people feel comfortable if in 50 years a group of people who have appropriated your culture could then teach it back to you? So, in my example, yesterday I disclosed that I do martial arts. Now, I don't know how people perceive that. Some people might perceive it as, oh yeah, that figures because you're part Chinese. But then I've been taught martial arts by white people. And if you look at the way certainly mixed martial arts has become a massive multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's so far removed from the original essence of what these practices are, which I have a bit of a problem with. But at the same time, I've been taught by people that have learnt this martial art because it came from the East, and they've learnt it here, and they've become masters at it, and they've become very good at it, and they've gone back over, they've gone to China to display their skills in the environment of its origins. The appropriation of culture might come around full circle, and it's actually we learning something about our culture which we wouldn't have learned because we're not in the place of its origin anymore.
I celebrate Eid with my friends, and I encourage them to embrace what Eid is about, and if they want to dress I'm from a Pakistani background, so they want to dress in Pakistani attire. That's absolutely fine by me, and I don't think that's wrong. Sometimes people say, well, actually, I don't want to do it because it's not part of my culture and I feel a bit uncomfortable. That's what offends me more than somebody trying something. And
I understand what you're saying about if you want to dress up in traditional Pakistani attire for Eid, etc., to show that you're embracing the culture. I understand that. If a white woman wants to wear a sari and wants to embrace that culture and wants to show that she's joining in with whatever it is, I think I've got issues when it's that way round. So today I fancy wearing a sari. Oh, okay, today I'm going to be Indian today. Or tomorrow I'm going to be Pakistani. And next week I'm going to go and be Arabian, whatever. You've got that choice to do that. I also think that that can be quite insulting. If you are not appreciative of the history from where that has come from, where you fit into that narrative, then I think that can be insultive and offensive. So your people came over to our country, stamped, raped and pillaged it, and now you've just decided to bugger off, and now you want to use it as a fancy dress costume. No, thank you very much. I think you'll find that it's quite offensive at times. Unless you understand what your role was in that situation, then please abstain.
My parents came, mum in the 70s, dad in the 50s, but they live in a very closed community, which they only wear their traditional clothes, they only eat their traditional food. My dad is also coming from a place where, I think he grew up during the 50s when Enoch Powell was spouting Rivers of Blood speech. So I was talking to him about something really important about my partner who isn't Pakistani, and he was saying these people aren't your people. These white people are not your people, and I was saying, but we're humans, and I know this is really simplifying it, and I was just trying to explain to him that his experience is different, so he's coming from a place of hurt that he's experienced, but I can mix with different things, and I feel that my parents have tried that, but it's just not too late for them, but it's just gone on too long for them, so they haven't mixed in a different way. I just think it's important that people are allowed to explore different things. I mean,
I don't think I would ever stop somebody. I think I see my job as making sure my child understands it, and I think power comes into it. So when you talk about the Canberra, was it the American cornrow? That becomes political because it's okay for Kylie Jenner to do it, but I can give you numerous examples of black children who've been excluded from school for doing it. I think with cultural appropriation we don't have a similar experience necessarily. I think being of Caribbean and African heritage, cultural appropriation is very different. It is often more violent. I think it's often also more negative.
Denver uses examples. So for example, she says, you have your cane rows, you plump your lips, you go on the tanning bed, you use plastic surgery to make your body more voluptuous, for example, whereas it's natural for people of African Caribbean descent, and it's frowned upon because it's sexualized and it's negative. Yeah. So as a black woman with that figure, you're like, but when the Kim Kardashian wants to get surgery to look like that, it's the greatest figure. Everybody wants this now. Do you know what I mean?
As a facilitator, I was trying to do the following things. Listen and try to ask questions that would help people to elaborate, clarify, explain and justify arguments put forward. Help people to identify areas that were in tension or at some way at odds with each other. Help people to find alternative viewpoints and arguments that were not present in the discussion, and to reflect on the experience of being in the discussion circle. One theme that appeared to emerge during the project was a concern with education, and particularly history education, and how in the UK the lack of attention to the British Empire made discussions about racism all the more challenging for many of the participants in their everyday lives.
So there was a piece that I've written that hasn't been posted yet, but it was when the BBC series Taboo was created with Tom Hardy, and he's involved in the East India Company. So why is it left to Tom Hardy and the BBC to produce this fictional piece of entertainment to teach people about the colonial past that is of this country, because otherwise it's just been eradicated. It's like it never happened. You look at the history curriculums at primary level, at secondary level, it's just not there. Having been through the system myself, not that long ago, you know, I know that for myself, and it wasn't until I had an option to study it that I was able to choose it at university level. So I think there's a real issue there that needs to be discussed with regards to education, curriculum, knowledge, and being able to equip young people and the next generation with the history that they have a right to know.
Education becomes so key.
This is why we're teachers, a lot of us. As a business teacher and as the history curriculum, those things for me go hand in hand. Gets left out completely out of the Peru setting where I teach. There's no history teaching whatsoever, because obviously kids have been excluded from mainstream. Why do they need any history anyways? And so then you've got these images of black people as consumers only. So they have no history. They have no role models they can look up to. So think about the links, right? And then all we are saying to them is that actually your culture, not even your culture, is your own, actually. Your only role is to be consumer and, of course, an underpaid worker. That's it. I'm going to leave it on that.
At the end of the 4 sessions, the participants reflected a little on the final one and on how they felt about the project as a whole.
A point of contention for me was this idea of restricting, drawing a line, having a boundary. I personally disagree with, and I felt that some other individuals disagreed as well. I think that boundary needs to be porous, so there are some things that you as a culture, you as an individual with a culture will hold on to, but that can also pass through to others. I think that's how we grow up multicultural.
What was difficult for me was facing up to the level of my own ignorance, the level of my own blindness to a lot of things. And I think for conversations and for interaction between human beings to be meaningful, it has to tread that line between, it can't be just aggressive and confrontational, but it does need to be really raw and real and some hard truths.
What helps have these sort of conversations that we've been having? You know, what helped here? What would help?
I guess the reading was helpful. I guess, just get some kind of talking point.
I think discussion, maybe possibly to the point of exhaustion, but not to the point of offence, is the right way to go about it. Because without discussion, it stays behind closed doors.
I'm wondering if you had any worries about offending people, and if you had any worries about being offended.
I wasn't concerned about being offended in the sense that it's my right to be offended and it's everybody else's right to be offended as well.
I didn't fear being offended. Racism is really clever like that. It doesn't work like that. It would be very unlikely that there would have been a white person sitting there saying, I hate black people. That wasn't going to happen. So I wasn't worried about that. I was concerned about not being offensive, if I would come across offensive, but understood.
I think I'm always worried I might offend somebody. So I think there is an element of self-editing. But I find that I am in some spaces, not here, but in some spaces where I can offend somebody by just being in the room. So, and I can't be held responsible for that.
I think one of the biggest challenges was paying attention in the broadest sense. To pay attention to the silences, to what was being expressed, and how that was being heard. Many of us shared a sense of discomfort at various times. So for facilitators, it's important to think about how discomfort is distributed in a group, in a classroom, and indeed in society.
My hope is that the project can be used to inspire further conversations.
And also to people sort of reflecting on some of the challenges of the discussions, and for people interested in anti-racist work, and people interested in education in the general sense.